The email arrived at 9:07 a.m., short and cold, ending a job and a man's dignity in the same breath. Yet by 9:26, the thunder of helicopter blades would force an entire building to confront how little it truly understood about loyalty, humility, and the quiet weight carried by a single father who had never asked to be seen. Ethan Walker arrived early, as he always did, because mornings were the only part of the day that belonged to him alone. Before the phones rang, before the executives filled the glass corridors with impatience, before the weight of being both provider and parent pressed down again, he unlocked the maintenance office, brewed cheap coffee, and checked his phone for the picture his daughter had sent of her cereal shaped like a smiling face. He smiled back at the screen, then tucked it away and got to work. The building hummed with machines that rarely earned gratitude unless they failed, and Ethan had spent years making sure they didn't. He fixed things quietly, documenting every repair, anticipating problems others overlooked. Still, he remained invisible to most of the people who passed him each day without learning his name. That morning, the CEO, Martin Hale, stood behind glass walls reviewing quarterly losses with irritation. He had inherited a company that prized appearances over patience, and lately, the numbers had been turning against him. Pressure traveled downward in organizations like Gravity, and Ethan felt it in the way supervisors spoke sharply and how blame searched for an easy target. When a minor system outage delayed a meeting by 7 minutes, Martin demanded answers. The report crossed his desk stripped of context, heavy on assumption. Maintenance failure. Ethan Walker. The name meant nothing to him beyond the irritation it sparked. Ethan was called upstairs without explanation. He wiped grease from his hands, straightened his shirt, and walked into a room filled with cold efficiency. Martin didn't look up for several seconds, as if delaying eye contact made the decision easier. The words came rehearsed, clinical, framed as necessity rather than choice. Budget cuts. Accountability. Immediate termination. Ethan listened without interrupting, the way he had learned to listen to teachers when his daughter struggled, the way he listened to life when it offered no room for negotiation. He asked one question, not about severance or appeal, but about finishing the task he had started that morning. Martin dismissed it with a wave, eager to move on. Ethan packed his tools slowly. Each sound felt amplified, each memory attached to a drawer or shelf tugging at something deeper. He thought of his daughter waiting after school, of rent due next week, of promises he had always kept. No anger showed on his face, only a quiet resolve that surprised even him. When he walked out, no one noticed. But somewhere beyond the building, unseen and unheard, events were already in motion that would soon demand every eye turn back to the man they had just erased. Outside, the air felt heavier, as if the sky itself sensed what had been taken. Ethan sat in his car, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the silence settle before calling his daughter's sitter. He explained simply, carefully choosing words that wouldn't frighten a child who already knew how fragile security could be. After ending the call, he reached into his glove compartment and removed a folded envelope he carried everywhere. Inside were documents he rarely thought about anymore, reminders of a life he had once lived in service, not to a company, but to something larger. He had never used those years as leverage. They belonged to him, not the world. Back inside the building, Martin resumed meetings, convinced he had acted decisively. Yet unease lingered. The outage that morning, minor as it was, hadn't followed a normal pattern. Systems that Ethan maintained never failed without warning. An assistant mentioned that maintenance logs were unusually detailed, almost predictive. Martin brushed it aside, unwilling to reopen a closed chapter. Control mattered more than curiosity. At 9:24, the sound arrived like a question no one could ignore. At first, it was distant, mistaken for construction or traffic. Then the windows began to tremble. Conversations stalled. Phones stopped ringing. The rhythm grew unmistakable, powerful, purposeful. A helicopter descended toward the adjacent landing area, reserved only for emergencies and high-level clearances. Security scrambled. Executives gathered near the windows, confusion replacing confidence. A call came through to reception, bypassing normal channels. The voice on the other end was calm, authoritative, asking for Ethan Walker by full name and rank. The receptionist hesitated, then repeated the request, uncertain she had heard correctly. When told he no longer worked there, the silence that followed carried more weight than anger ever could. The response was measured but firm. He was still required. Immediately, Martin's face drained of color as understanding crept in, unwelcome and undeniable. He demanded clarification, credentials, explanations. They came swiftly, each one dismantling his assumptions. The helicopter belonged to the Navy. The request was non-negotiable. Ethan Walker was not simply a maintenance technician. He was a specialist whose experience had been quietly called upon during rare, critical situations. His dismissal had not changed that reality. Outside, the helicopter's blade slowed, but its presence felt immense, exposing the fragile hierarchy Martin had built. Inside, phones rang again, this time with urgency edged by regret. The company that prided itself on control now waited helplessly for a man it had discarded minutes earlier, forced to confront how quickly authority collapses when it forgets respect. Ethan returned not with triumph, but with composure, stepping from his car as security rushed toward him with apologies layered over panic. He listened, nodded, and followed without comment. The helicopter crew waited with disciplined patience, offering him a respectful greeting that contrasted sharply with the indifference he had left behind. In that moment, Ethan felt the old weight return, not as a burden, but as a reminder of who he had chosen to be when no one was watching. Inside the building, eyes followed him differently now. Whispers replaced dismissals. Martin stood rigid, rehearsing words that no longer felt sufficient. When Ethan entered the executive suite, the room fell silent. He was asked, not ordered, to explain. He did so simply, without embellishment, describing a system vulnerability only he recognized, one that intersected with a broader issue the Navy had been monitoring. His knowledge wasn't theoretical. It was lived, earned through years of quiet service and sacrifice. As he spoke, Martin saw the cost of his decision reflected not in anger, but in restraint. Ethan never mentioned the firing. He focused on the problem, on resolution, on responsibility. The contrast unsettled Martin more than any accusation could have. He realized that leadership was not asserted through authority alone, but revealed through how one treated those who held the world together unnoticed. The crisis was resolved within the hour. The helicopter lifted away, leaving behind a silence heavy with reflection. Martin asked Ethan to stay, offering reinstatement, compensation, recognition. Ethan listened, then asked for time. He stepped outside, calling his daughter, asking about her day, grounding himself in what mattered. When he returned, his answer surprised everyone. He agreed to return, not for status or apology, but for stability and purpose. On one condition: respect would no longer be optional. Systems, like people, required care, foresight, and humility. Martin accepted, understanding that the lesson extended beyond one man. It reshaped policies, conversations, and the invisible culture that defined the company. Ethan resumed his role, now seen but unchanged, continuing to arrive early, work quietly, and go home on time to read bedtime stories. The building functioned better after that day, not because of fear, but because awareness had replaced ego. And Ethan, the single father once dismissed as expendable, carried forward knowing that dignity, once recognized, could transform not just a moment, but an entire way of seeing. Weeks passed, and the story faded from headlines, but not from hearts. Martin found himself observing more, speaking less, learning the names of people he had once overlooked. He noticed how small gestures altered morale, how listening changed outcomes. Ethan noticed too, though he never claimed credit. He taught younger technicians patiently, shared knowledge freely, and declined praise with a quiet smile. At home, his daughter sensed the shift, not in words, but in ease. Evenings felt lighter. Laughter returned to their routines. One afternoon, Martin asked Ethan to join him for coffee, not as a superior, but as a learner. He spoke of pressure, of fear, of how easily authority blinds. Ethan listened, offering no judgment, only perspective shaped by loss and responsibility. He spoke of nights spent calculating grocery budgets, of choosing integrity when no one rewarded it, of believing that character mattered even when circumstances disagreed. The conversation changed them both. Martin began mentoring differently, leading with curiosity instead of control. Ethan found renewed purpose in being exactly where he was, doing work that mattered quietly. The company's culture shifted, slowly but sincerely, reflecting the values it had nearly discarded. The helicopter never returned, but its echo remained, a reminder etched into memory. For Ethan, it wasn't about recognition. It was about being seen without having to demand it. For Martin, it was about learning that leadership begins where ego ends. Time continued, as it always does, smoothing sharp edges, but preserving truths. The moment that could have been a spectacle became instead a lesson carried forward in countless small decisions. And in those decisions, the real transformation lived, proving that humility, once learned, reshapes not only outcomes, but lives. Years later, Ethan would barely mention the day when asked. He preferred to talk about his daughter's graduation, about systems upgraded quietly, about people growing into their potential. Martin would speak of it differently, acknowledging the mistake that taught him the most. The company thrived, not because it avoided failure, but because it learned how to honor the people who prevented it. The lesson endured in simplicity. Listen before judging. See before deciding. Value the unseen. In a world obsessed with titles and speed, it was the quiet consistency of a single father that left the deepest mark. The helicopter had come and gone, but what it revealed remained, echoing through lives changed not by spectacle, but by understanding. True power is not shown in the ability to dismiss, but in the wisdom to recognize worth before it must announce itself. Compassion, humility, and patience are not weaknesses in leadership or in life. They are the forces that quietly hold everything together. When we choose to see people fully, especially when they seem ordinary, we discover that the greatest transformations begin with the simplest human respect.